Have you ever wondered where the phrase kill two birds with one stone came from? I was wondering that exact same thing this week. Unfortunately, this podcast episode is not going to give you that answer, so I encourage you to go look it up yourself. But what this podcast will answer, or at least give you some insight to, is our president, Thomas Jefferson, being a swashbuckling, pirate defeating president, and a ship that I got to meet in person and got to tour in person and where it got its fabulous name. So, welcome to another episode of Archives and Anchovies, the podcast where I talk about whatever it is I want to talk about that week. This week was a fantastic week again for me. I really enjoyed doing the research for this podcast. I have, as most of you probably do, a screensaver on my computer, and that screensaver just does a random set of pictures. And one of the pictures that came up was the tour that I took when one of my kids was in JROTC in high school of the USS Preble, excuse me. That ship is a Burley class destroyer. It is a guided missile destroyer and also has a laser weapon on it. So it was really cool to see. And as that picture came up, I reminisced a little bit about the day and wondered who was Preble and why was this ship named after Preble. If you listen to my podcast on the Arizona and the Missouri, it's pretty easy to understand where they got their names and how they classified those battleships. But I had no idea who Preble was. So in my research, it took me down this rabbit hole that I'm now going to share with you, and I hope you enjoy it. If you think of the Marine song that plays, the first part of that song is going to be from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. So this episode will also cover America's real first foreign conflict, which is pretty cool in the fact that after we became a country, we had foreign conflicts all the way back to the earliest days of America. So we need to start back and talk about how the world existed back in the 1700s. The Mediterranean Sea, it was one of the most important trade routes on Earth, connected Europe with the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. But sailing through the Mediterranean came with a price, and that was a literal price. It could have a price that was your life, it could be your boats, but there's actually a price. So, four North American African states controlled much of the southern Mediterranean coast: Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Today, we'd call those Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. But back then, they were semi autonomous provinces of the Ottoman Empire. So, that same Ottoman Empire that you've heard about in the history books. These particular states had developed a lucrative business model: state-sponsored piracy. Here's how it worked. So ships sailing through the Mediterranean would be captured by Barbary corsairs, pirates operating out of these North African ports. The cargo would be seized, and the crews would actually be taken as captives. Some of them were enslaved, but others held for ransom. If your nation wanted safe passage through the Mediterranean, you paid an annual tribute. Think of it as a very expensive protection racket. So if you have ever seen or read The Hunger Games, you know that they had tributes. They had tributes that would be paid for by their lives. So they would have those games and those tributes were there. So very similar as far as paying for that type of protection from the capital. And here's the thing. The major European powers were totally fine with this arrangement. Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands, they all paid their tributes. It was cheaper than maintaining constant naval patrols in the Mediterranean and using ships and resources, and it gave them a competitive advantage. Smaller nations that couldn't afford those tributes simply were not protected, and they also then could not trade in that region. So they really dominated the trade region as far as the Mediterranean goes. When America was still part of the British Empire, American merchant ships sailed under British protection. So that's how it kind of started. American ships still could do the trades in the Mediterranean, but they were protected by the British paying those tributes. But all that changed in 1783 after, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, and then the Revolutionary War ended in 1783, and the United States won its independence. That protection from Britain vanished overnight. American ships were now easy targets for the Barbary states, and they knew it. So in July 1785, Algerian pirates seized one of the American merchant ships, the Maria, off the coast of Portugal. A few days later, they captured the Dolphin. 21 American sailors were dragged back to Algiers in chains. This wasn't just about money, this was a humanitarian crisis. So, humanitarian crises have been around for a long time. These men would spend basically more than a decade in captivity, and some would die there as well. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were serving as diplomats in Europe at the time. This was prior to his presidency, and they met with Tripoli's ambassador to London, a man named Sidi Haji Abdurrahman, to try to resolve this situation. So Jefferson later recounted their specific conversation, and he asked the Barbary states why they attacked the American ships when America at this point had done nothing to provoke them. The ambassador's answer, which Jefferson recorded word for word in a report to Congress, was chilling in its directness. According to Jefferson, the ambassador stated that it was the right to capture and enslave Americans, and it was founded on the laws of the prophet, and that it was written in the Quran that all nations who stood should not have answered their authority were sinners, that it was their right and duty to make war upon them whenever they could be found, and to make slaves of all they could take prisoners, and that every Mussulman who should be slain in battle was sure to go to paradise. So Jefferson was just floored by this. The ambassador went on to explain that it was a law that the first who boarded the enemy vessel to basically enslave those men would each receive one more than his share of the rest, which basically operated as an incentive for the most desperate and gave them more courage to want to be the first person to go up there. So in other words, bravery in capturing infidels was divinely rewarded at that time. So as I said, Jefferson was horrified by this entire system. He argued passionately that America should refuse to pay and instead build a navy to protect its ships by force. If you've listened to my Hamilton and Jefferson podcast, or really Hamilton and Mozart, there's a part where we talk about Jefferson in there as well. Jefferson and Hamilton did not see eye to eye on a lot of things, but Hamilton did feel that there was a strong desire to have a strong navy so that they could protect their shores. Adams, however, disagreed. He argued that America at this point simply didn't have the money or naval power to fight, and the pragmatic solution was for them to pay the tribute. So they did. Congress sided with Adams. In 1995, the United States signed a treaty with Algiers agreeing to pay $642,500 upfront, nearly $1 million when you include the naval stores and other goods, plus $21,600 annually. Similar treaties followed with Tripoli and Tunis. By 1800, tribute payments to the Barbary states consumed roughly 20% of the entire federal government's annual revenues. We were a infant America at that point in time and didn't generate the revenue, obviously, that we do today. And so it was 20% just paying to those four states. To put that in perspective, if today's federal government spent 20% of its budget, not on defense, not on healthcare, not on infrastructure, but simply paying pirates to not attack our ships, that was the situation that America faced. By 1801, Thomas Jefferson was now president, and he was done paying this tribute. He had had enough. But the decision to go to war wasn't really his to make. The Pasha of Tripoli made that for him. So what ended up happening is Yusuf Karamanli had become Pasha of Tripoli through the oldest method in the book. He murdered his older brother and exiled another one of his brothers. Yusuf was ambitious and he was greedy. He looked at the amount that Algiers was getting from America and decided Tripoli deserved even more, so much more. He demanded $225,000 from America, and then also $25,000 annually, roughly 10 times what Tripoli had previously been receiving. When Jefferson refused, Yusuf did something symbolic and dramatic. On May 10th, 1801, he ordered his soldiers to chop down the flagpole at the American consulate in Tripoli. This was a traditional Barbary declaration of war. Jefferson's response was measured, but it was firm. Without asking Congress for a declaration of war, a decision that would later spark constitutional debates, which may be a later podcast because it was pretty fascinating what happened. He ordered naval squadrons to the Mediterranean. His instructions were to protect America, commerce, and if attacked, respond with force if needed. The first squadron that arrived in the Mediterranean in July 1801 consisted of 3 frigates and a schooner. The commander, Commodore Richard Dale, set up a blockade of Tripoli. There were some early successes. In August, the USS Enterprise engaged and captured a ship called the Tripoli in a fierce battle. But the blockade wasn't particularly effective. The American ships had to periodically return to the port for supplies and repairs, leaving gaps in the Tripolitan vessels that they could exploit it. The war dragged on through 1802 with very, very little progress. But everything changed when Commodore Edward Preble took command of the Mediterranean Squadron in 1803. And this brings us back to the ship that I got to visit when I was on vacation for me, but going to see this ship, and we were on this trip for JROTC. It was the USS Preble. So Edward Preble was the commander of the Mediterranean Squadron in 1803. And Preble, he was 42 years old at this point, which back in that time was pretty old. And it made him ancient by the standards of the young officers that were in his command. Most were in their 20s. They actually started calling him Old Man Preble behind his back, though not without the respect of the commander that he deserved. Preble was demanding, short-tempered, and absolute stickler for discipline and his professional seamanship. He drilled his officers relentlessly, insisted on gunnery practice. He wouldn't tolerate any sloppiness. His young officers, including Stephen Decatur, who we'll hear more about a little bit, didn't always like him, but they learned from him. Under Preble's command, the American Mediterranean Squadron transformed from a scattered collection of ships into a real devastating fighting force. Preble tightened the blockade of Tripoli and made it clear he was willing to take much more aggressive action. But then he came to disaster that would define his command and change the course of the war. October 31st, 1803, USS Philadelphia, one of the finest frigates in the American fleet, was chasing a vessel from Tripoli near the harbor of Tripoli. Captain William Bainbridge was an experienced officer, but he didn't know the waters very well. At around noon, with a sickening crunch, the Philadelphia ran hard aground on an uncharted reef. Bainbridge tried everything he could. His crew threw the ship's cannons overboard to lighten it. They cut away the foremost. Nothing worked. The ship was stuck fast, and Tripolitan gunboats were closing in all around him. After a 4-hour ordeal with no hope of escape, Bainbridge surrendered. More than 300 American officers and sailors were taken prisoner. They would spend the next 19 months in captivity in Tripoli, held in filthy condition, used as bargaining chips. But the worst part was the Tripolitans now had the Philadelphia. They had a USS ship. And once the wind and tide shifted, they managed to float her off the reef and tow her to the harbor. So they now had the USS Philadelphia to use against America. After the repairs, one of America's most powerful ships would be turned against the American fleet at that time. This is where Stephen Decatur enters our story. He was only 25 years old, but he was already a lieutenant in the Navy and had a reputation for courage bordering on recklessness. Kind of sounds like Hamilton. When Decatur heard about the Philadelphia, he immediately began planning one of the most daring military operations in American history. His plan was simple. It was a concept nearly impossible to think about execution, but sail into Tripoli's heavily fortified harbor at night, board the Philadelphia, set her on fire, and escape before the Tripolitans could react. The harbor was protected by 115 guns mounted on shore batteries, plus the castle walls, plus guard boats. So there was a ton of protection. If anything went wrong, Decatur and his men would be killed or join Bainbridge in captivity. Decatur commandeered a vessel called the Intrepid, a small Tripolitan ketch that Americans captured earlier. Preble, here's where part of his genius gun, approved the mission, but was deeply, deeply anxious about it. He was sending some of his best officers and men to almost certain death or capture. On the night of February 16th, 1804, with 75 volunteers hiding below deck, Decatur sailed into Tripoli harbor. They approached the Philadelphia, disguised as a local trading vessel. A Maltese pilot on board called out in Arabic that they had lost their anchors and requested permission to tie up alongside the Philadelphia for the night. The guards on the Philadelphia agreed, but as they drew close, one of the Tripolitan sailors of the Philadelphia became suspicious. He started shouting an alarm. There was no time for stealth anymore. "Board!" Decatur shouted. The Americans poured out from below deck and swarmed over the Philadelphia's sides. There was a brief, vicious fight in the darkness. Swords, pistols, hand-to-hand combat. Minutes went by, but within minutes, the crew was either dead or had jumped overboard, the Tripolitan crew. Now Decatur's men moved fast. They spread combustible materials throughout the ship, in the cockpit, the berth deck, the storerooms. They set fires in multiple locations. Within 20 minutes, The Philadelphia was now engulfed in flames, the fire spreading from mast to mast. Shore batteries opened up, cannons thundering in the night. Shots splashed around the Intrepid, and Decatur's men rowed desperately to get out of range. The flames from the Philadelphia lit up the entire harbor, making them easy targets for the cannons above. Miraculously and impossibly, they made it out. Not a single American was killed. Behind them, the Philadelphia burned down to the waterline and it sank. When news of the raid reached Britain, Admiral Horatio Nelson, who was at that time perhaps the greatest naval commander alive, called it the most bold and daring act of the age. That's really high praise coming from a man who had won the Battle of the Nile and would go on to win at Trafalgar. Preble was ecstatic. The successful raid restored his reputation after the loss of the Philadelphia had started to ruin it, and proved that American forces could strike back effectively. Over the next several months, Preble orchestrated a series of attacks on Tripoli. In August and September of 1804, he launched 5 major bombardments of the city and harbor using gunboats and bomb catches, borrowed from the Kingdom of Naples, nonetheless, to get close to shore. American ships pounded Tripoli's fortifications, while smaller boats engaged in close quarters combat with Tripolitan gunboats. Stephen Decatur distinguished himself again using these attacks, boarding and capturing enemy gunboats, hand-to-hand fighting, but there was tragedy as well. Decatur's younger brother, James Decatur, was killed after being treacherously shot while attempting to accept a Tripolitan surrender. Stephen Decatur avenged his brother in a fierce boarding action that became legendary among American sailors. Preble, he was aggressive, and his aggressive campaign put enormous pressure on Tripoli, but it didn't force a surrender. So in September of 1804, just as the attacks were showing results, Preble was relieved of his command. A more senior officer, Commodore Samuel Barron, arrived to take over the squadron. Preble returned home, disappointed that he hadn't finished the job. But Preble's impact was enormous. The officers he trained, the men who would become known as Preble Boys, would go on to lead U.S. Navy for the next generation. Nearly all of the Navy's heroes from the War of 1812 had served under Preble in the Mediterranean. Decatur, Isaac Hull, William Bainbridge, Charles Stewart, and others. Preble had transformed a collection of ships into a professional fighting force and had instilled in his young officers the aggressive, offensive spirit that would define the American naval tradition. So he was a pretty amazing man. It was amazing to be on the ship. And now, knowing this history, I look back at it even more fondly, knowing how this person transformed the Navy, essentially, and this ship was named after him. The burning of the Philadelphia was a tremendous moral boost, and Preble's sustained attacks had weakened Tripoli considerably, but the war wasn't over yet. It became clear that naval power alone wasn't going to force Yusuf to surrender. They needed to threaten him on land. Enter William Eaton, one of the most interesting characters in the American military history. He was a former army officer serving as the U.S. consul to Tunis. He was tough, ambitious, and had an idea that sounded completely crazy: march an army across Libyan desert to attack Tripoli from the land side. There was just one problem. Eaton didn't have an army, so he decided to create one from scratch. Eaton tracked down Hamid Karamali, the older brother that Yusuf had exiled years earlier. This sounds like a movie. An exiled person that's bitter gets brought on a team for revenge. Hamid had a legitimate claim to the rule of Tripoli. So he and Eaton made a plan, and Eaton's plan was to restore Hamid to power with American military support, creating a friendly government in Tripoli that would end the piracy. He got approved, sort of. Jefferson in the administration gave him vague support without fully committing to his plan, but Eaton pressed forward anyway. If you think about that time, we're talking about 1805. It took a long time for information to get across just the nation, more so than it took to get across the entire world. Some of these things, if he just decided to press on his own, may not be reported for months. In March 1805, Eaton assembled the most bizarre military expedition in American history. His force consisted of 8 U.S. Marines, led by Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, about 40 Greek and Italian mercenaries, a company of Arab cavalry loyal to Hamid, and a few hundred Bedouin fighters. They also had camels for transport. This ragtag army set out from Alexandria, Egypt on March 8, 1805, heading west across the Libyan desert toward the city of Derna, which is about 500 miles away. The march was hell. They crossed barren deserts where temperatures soared during the day and plummeted during the night. Water was scarce, Food was scarce. The different ethnic groups in the army didn't trust each other at all and frequently came close to fighting amongst themselves, which you can probably understand. The mercenaries kept demanding more money and wanting to be paid more. The Arab cavalry nearly deserted multiple times, with Hammett barely keeping them under control. Eaton held his fictitious army together through sheer willpower, along with the promise that American warships with supplies would meet them in Derna. After 50 days of marching, 50 days of heat, thirst, near mutinies, and constant danger, they finally spotted Derna, April 25th, 1805. Derna was a fortified coastal city defended by a garrison of several hundred soldiers. The city's governor, seeing this odd army approaching, sent a message to Eaton demanding that he leave immediately. Eaton's reply was very succinct: "My head or yours." On April 27th, 1805, the attack began. 3 American warships offshore, the Argus, Nautilus, and Hornet, opened fire on the city's defenses with their cannons. Eaton split his small force, sending Hammett and the Arab cavalry to attack from the land side, while he personally led the Marines, Greek, and Italian mercenaries, and they were coming from an assault in a completely different direction and a direct assault on the harbor fortifications. Lieutenant O'Bannon and his 8 Marines charged the harbor fort. Think about that. 8 Marines assaulting a fortified position. The fighting was desperate and close quartered. Eaton himself was hit in the wrist by a musket ball, but the Americans and their allies fought with such ferocity that the defenders began to break. After hours of intense combat, O'Bannon and his Marines fought their way to the top of the harbor fort. There, for the first time in American history, they raised the American flag over a fortress on foreign soil. Pretty dramatic moment if you think about that in history. By late afternoon, the city had fallen. The governor and his forces retreated into the interior. Eaton, O'Bannon, and their unlikely army had achieved one of the most remarkable victories in military history. A tiny force of Americans and their allies had captured a fortified city thousands of miles from home. This is the event that commemorated the Marine Corps hymn, "To the Shores of Tripoli," and it's why Marine Corps officers still carry the Mamluk sword modeled after the sword that Hammett presented to Lieutenant O'Bannon as a gift of honor and gratitude. But here's where the story takes a turn that frustrated Eaton for the rest of his life. While Eaton was preparing to march further westward to Tripoli itself, diplomats were negotiating. Yusuf Karomali, seeing the fall of Derna and worried about the threat posed by his brother's return, became much more amenable to peace talks. On June 3rd, 1805, the United States and Tripoli signed a peace treaty. The terms required that America to pay a one-time ransom of $60,000 for the release of Captain Bainbridge and the Philadelphia's crew, but there would be no more annual tribute payments, and American shipping would have free passage. For the Jefferson administration, this was success. The war was over, the prisoners were coming home, and the tribute system had ended, at least with Tripoli. But for William Eaton, he almost felt betrayed. The treaty abandoned Hammett Camerali, who had fought alongside American forces and now had to flee for his life because he had betrayed his older brother. Eaton spent years afterward lobbying Congress for compensation for Hammett and bitterly criticizing the administration's decision to negotiate rather than to continue the military campaign. So, what do we make of the First Barbary War? In raw military terms, it wasn't a huge conflict. There were casualties on both sides, but they were relatively light. There was no major territorial changes. There was not really much land or anything that was taken, but its significance goes far beyond these surface details. First, the war established as a fundamental principle of American foreign policy: the United States would defend its interests and its citizens abroad, even if that meant protecting military power thousands of miles from home. Thomas Jefferson, despite being an advocate for limited government and military restraint, proved willing to use force when American sovereignty was challenged. So that was highly significant at the time, and for Thomas Jefferson as far as what his methodology and his thought process was. On a second note, the war demonstrated the importance of naval power. Before this conflict, there was a serious debate about whether America even needed a standing navy at all. The Barbary War settled that question. Naval power was essential for protecting American commerce and protecting American influence. Thirdly, the war created legends and traditions. Stephen Decatur became America's first post-Revolutionary War military hero. The Marines earned their place in American military tradition. These weren't just symbolic victories that they had. They helped forge the identity of a young nation still figuring out its place in the world. There's also a cautionary tale here about the limits of military force. The United States won tactical victories, but the underlying problem of Barbary piracy continued. Algeria, Tunis, and Morocco kept demanding tribute from other nations. It would take a second Barbary War in 1815 to fully resolve that issue. That is an entirely different podcast episode, and I may or may not do it, but totally a different type of war that happened then. And even then, the European powers would continue dealing with North African piracy for decades. We still have piracy today in some aspects. So we should acknowledge this complex legacy. This war, in part of a conflict between Western and Islamic civilization with religious and cultural dimensions that Americans of the time struggled to understand. The rhetoric used to justify the war, civilized nations versus barbarous pirates, reflected prejudices that would echo through later conflicts in history. At the same time, Americans expressing outrage about their sailors being enslaved were themselves participating in the Atlantic slave trade and maintaining the institution of slavery at home. So there is definitely a dichotomy there, and there's a historical irony that shouldn't be ignored when you look at the full picture. The First Barbary War is a reminder that American history is critically complicated. It's filled with contradictions and even small conflicts that have outsized impacts on how a nation sees itself and has been seen by the world. The next time somebody mentions "To the Shores of Tripoli" or you hear that Marine song, you'll know the real story. You'll know about the Philadelphia burning in the middle of the night. You'll know about 8 Marines and a few dozen mercenaries marching across the desert. You'll know about a young nation deciding that it would rather fight than pay tribute to pirates 2,000 miles away. This was America's first foreign war, fought in an age of sailing ships and sword fights. Muskets were used, but it was primarily hand-to-hand combat. It was impossible odds, and unlikely heroes were emerged from this conflict. It's a story that deserves to be remembered and honored. All of this came from me seeing one small picture on my computer screen of the USS Preble. It took me down a rabbit hole that I never thought I would go through, and it really made me understand that part of where we were as America during this time. I appreciate you listening. I appreciate you watching. Hope this was extremely informative, and it was also entertaining for you to listen to. I appreciate any comments that you may have. If you could throw me a like, if you could throw me a comment, that would be great. Obviously, share the podcast as well. Until next time, for Archives and Anchovies, I'm James. I'm your host. Have a wonderful afternoon, a great evening, and an amazing week. Thank you.